Hello, macro students. This is Mr. Clarke. Good to talk to everybody. I don't really know what I'm talking about. Anyways, hope everybody's doing well. And I made this is a quick video which is going to talk you through basically topics 5 and 6 of Unit 3. And what 5 and 6 are going to look at in Unit 3 is we're putting together short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and long-run aggregate supply. So up to this point, we've learned about what shifts aggregate demand. We've learned about what shifts short-run aggregate supply. We've learned what long-run aggregate supply looks like. Now we're going to put all three together to create macroeconomic scenarios and conditions, meaning we're going to be able to graph, this is what a recession looks like. This is what an expansion looks like. This is what expansionary gaps look like versus inflationary gaps. This is what stagflation looks like. Okay, guys? So we're going to be able to apply the determinants that shift short-run supply and aggregate demand and put them on a graph. Okay? So this is going to be slides 67 to, I think it's 74 of the Unit 3 notes. There'll be some review at the end, so feel free to pause the video when we get to the review, or if I'm going too fast, pause it, and away we go. All right, so if you look here, pause the video if you want to take a look at this graph. Now, we got two curves on this graph. We have short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Okay, so you have to figure out, all right, what curve is shifting, in what direction, and what economic condition is it creating? What type of shock is it? Okay, so ask yourself those questions. Pause the video if you'd like, and then we'll discuss it. All right, so in this scenario, you have short-run aggregate supply shifting to the left. So what does that mean? That means this is a decrease. This is a decrease in supply. So some things that could be causing a decrease in aggregate supply could be an increase in input prices, a decrease in the availability of technology, government heavily regulating this industry or this macroeconomic sector or the entire macroeconomy, the government imposing higher taxes on the macroeconomy, workers becoming less productive. Any of those determinants could lead to a decrease in supply. So when you have a decrease in supply, this is known as you have a negative supply shock. Okay? And what a negative supply shock leads to, then you have to ask yourself, these things. After the shift, what's the effect on unemployment? What's the effect on real wages? What's the effect on real GDP? What's the effect on price levels after the shift? We want to ask ourselves mainly those four things, okay? So then we could just use arrows to indicate the effects. So let's start with price levels. Let's start from the bottom and work our way up. So ask yourself, with the negative supply shock, what's the effect on price levels? We know that price levels have increased, okay? What's the effect on real GDP? Well, real GDP started at Y1. It's shifted to the left with Y2. We're now at Y2. So real GDP is decreased. What's the effect on real wages? Now remember, real wages take out inflation. So anytime there is inflation, real wages are falling. So since there's inflation here, we have a decline in real wages. Now we're earning less. You know, if you wanted to put it into numbers, let's say that you received a 2% pay raise during this time, maybe like when you were at equilibrium, and now prices have increased by, say, 3%. So your real wage is actually decreased by is decreased by 1%. Wages went up by 2, your nominal wage was 2%, prices were increasing by 3%, your real wages fell by 1%. And to figure out the connection between unemployment and real GDP, just look at the connection here. When real GDP falls, unemployment rises. It's a negative relationship. When real GDP falls, that means businesses are putting less towards production. People aren't demanding for whatever reason. In this case, it's prices. They're not demanding as many goods and services, so you don't need as many workers. You're not producing as much. So you're laying some people off. When real GDP falls, unemployment rises. So guys, hopefully this shows the connection between applying some of the topics we learned about earlier in the unit with like supply determinants to a negative supply shock, which we've learned about, and now to the effect it has on some economic determinants, unemployment or economic variables, unemployment, real wages, real GDP, and price levels, okay? Those are the skills you gotta have up to this point. Okay. Also remember, I didn't mention this. This is stagflation, the leftward shift in supply. Higher prices coupled with higher unemployment lead to stagflation. It's a terrible economic condition that has existed a handful of times in the United States macroeconomic history. And I like to say stagflation is the Toby of the economy. If you enjoy the Office references there. Okay. All right. So now I'll take a look at this one. Positive or negative supply shock. This is a positive supply shock, okay, because for whatever reason, lower input costs, higher technology, higher productivity, less government regulations, supply is shifting to the right. And so now we have to figure out the effect on unemployment rates, price levels, real GDP, real wages, okay? Let's start with price levels. In this case, prices are falling with the shift in supply. Price levels have fallen. And we can go right to real wages there. Since prices are falling, that means people's real wages are rising. Okay. We're going from Y to Y1. Means that you have an increase in GDP and a decrease in unemployment. Okay, remember those two relationships. Remember the relationship between price levels and real wages, and remember the relationship between unemployment rates and real GDP. If you know those two things, you're in good shape here. And a lot of this, guys, is the skill is A, being able to apply an economic situation like input prices decrease. Okay, rightward shift in supply. B, being able to read the graph. What happened to prices? What happened to real GDP? C, connect the effect on prices and real GDP to unemployment rates and real wages. Okay. All right, so we got two different graphs here. On the right, we have a positive demand shock. So this one right here is a positive demand shock. Over here, don't worry about that. I couldn't find for whatever reason, when I created these slides, I couldn't find just a negative demand shock. Don't worry about supply here. What I'm circling, this is a negative demand shock, okay? So make sure you know when you have a positive demand shock, a negative demand shock, what the effects are on price levels and real GDP. And then after that, what the effect is on real wages and unemployment. So if we looked at the one on the left here, the positive demand shock, prices have increased. In this case, this is healthy inflation, and GDP has increased. So when you have a positive demand shock, price levels go up, real wages fall, GDP increases, and unemployment decreases. The other one, negative demand shock, fall in prices, you have deflation, so real wages should rise. Problem here, though, is that more people are going to be out of work because unemployment has decreased, or because real GDP has decreased. I'm sorry. Real GDP has decreased with the leftward shift in demand. More people are going to be out of work. Some other skills you need to know. Now notice that for these two graphs, we brought in a new variable. We brought in long run aggregate supply. So long run aggregate supply, remember, is that measuring stick. It's the goal. It's where your economy wants to be. Okay. So give me 1 second here. Let me go back to my main slides. Long run aggregate supply in full employment. Remember, that means full employment, long run aggregate supply. Because in the long run, all costs are variable. So this condition right here when you have aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply intersect with long-run aggregate supply, this is known as long-run equilibrium. Because this right here, long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, over here, aggregate demand. Okay? So this right here is where your economy wants to be. If your short-run equilibrium is in line with long-run equilibrium, so you're in good shape. That's where you want to be. That means you're at full employment. Okay? In the text box too. At natural rate of unemployment. Remember I talked about how the AP likes to use a few different terms to describe the same thing. Long-run equilibrium, full employment, natural rate of unemployment. They're all the same thing. It's the goal. It's where you want to be as an economy. Okay? So if you're at that point, you're in good shape. Now we're going to talk about what if you're not at that point? What if your short-run equilibrium is over here? What if your short-run equilibrium is over here? What economic situation is created then? So that can be found on slide 72. So in this case, right here, if you follow the red arrow, let's make this is graph A, and this one will be graph B. Okay? Graph A is showing a recessionary gap. I'll explain why. The recessionary gap, the one over here, this is known as expansionary, or sometimes they like to say this is an inflationary gap. This is why graph A is a recessionary gap. If you look, find your short-run equilibrium. Your short-run equilibrium, this is important. Short-run equilibrium is where short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect. They intersect right here. Now notice that they're behind their goal. They're not at long-run equilibrium. So because of that, because they're down here and they're not here, this tells you that real GDP is less than what it's supposed to be, which means more people are out of work, higher unemployment rates, lower GDP. Your economy is not performing up to par where you should be. This is a recessionary gap. Your economy's in a recession. So in future units, we'll talk about what the federal government, what the Federal Reserve Bank does to fix that. You know, this is like COVID-19, guys. This is COVID-19. This is 2008 housing market crash. This is, 1929 Great Depression. This is a recessionary gap. Over here, notice that your short-run equilibrium is ahead. Remember, short-run equilibrium is where short-run supply and aggregate demand intersect. You're ahead of your goal. Here's long-run equilibrium, long-run supply. You're ahead of it, okay? And so because of that means your economy is doing better than expected. So this is like the economy, you could arguably say before COVID-19, mid-2000s, roaring 20s, if you want to use those as examples. And the reason they call it an inflationary gap, well, look at, because aggregate demand is increased here, prices are higher now than they would be if you were at long-run equilibrium. Prices are higher, but that's probably okay, at least at this point, because GDP is roaring and businesses need workers. So in a little bit, we'll talk about how the economy gets back to long-run equilibrium. But for right now, you should be able to graph economic situations, determine the effect on unemployment rates, price levels, real GDP, real wages. And then, including long-run aggregate supply, graph a recessionary gap, like on graph A, and graph an expansionary or inflationary gap, like on graph B, okay? Remember, expansionary gap, you're to the right of long run, you're ahead. Recessionary gap, you're to the left, you're behind long run, okay? Those are the tips. I say below, you could also say to the left, okay? To the left above to the right is an expansionary. Keep those things in mind. All right, so go ahead and pause the video if you want. We'll talk about this slide, and then we'll wrap it up for the day. Okay, so let's look at this one. Recessionary gap occurs when short-run equilibrium is we're going to say behind or to the left of long-run equilibrium. An inflationary expansionary gap occurs when short-run equilibrium is ahead or to the right of long-run equilibrium. Just abbreviated there, left and right. Behind, ahead. Cost-push inflation occurs when short-run, here I'll just put a text box to be a little quicker. Short-run aggregate supply shifts where? Shifts to the left. And demand pull inflation occurs, think of the term itself, demand pull. It's when aggregate demand shifts to the right. Showed in a couple of those graphs. Also keep in mind, cost push inflation, stagflation. Okay. Check your work on that. Pause the video once more. See if you can fill in the blank for these four. Okay, so a positive demand shock. Anytime we're thinking positive, we're thinking a rightward shift. Remember, rightward shift, regardless of whether it's supply or demand, is positive. So anytime you hear positive, it's moving to the right, like up and to the right with supply or demand. Positive supply shock is also a rightward shift. Okay. Short-run equilibrium is the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. Okay. And long-run equilibrium is the intersection of short-run, long-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. Not bad without a text box, if I do say so myself. Okay. Those are the tips right there at the bottom. I kind of just went over those earlier in the video. You know, if you're looking for skills to have in these units, in these topics, those are the three skills. You know, being able to analyze a scenario, graph it, read the graph, and apply macroeconomic situations to it. Okay, guys? Next topic, we will talk about what the economy does when they're in a recessionary gap versus expansionary gap, how it reacts. But for right now, if you got these things, you're in good shape. Hope the video helped. Talk to you soon.